Kendrick Lamar has been one of the most important voices in hip-hop and popular music in general for over a decade now. And perhaps the apogee of everything he'd been trying to convey was achieved on his 2015 album To Pimp A Butterfly. But I'm not here to tell you that it's a really good album, or album of the year, or decade, or anything like that, because if you're on this video you probably know that already. Instead, in this video we're going to take a close look at how Kendrick and his collaborators incorporate jazz music into the album, creating one of the most cohesive blends of the two genres, and a genre-defining masterpiece of jazz rap. The first and most obvious way in which Kendrick incorporates jazz into the record comes in his assembly of an elite band of young, mostly LA-based jazz musicians to assist him on the record. Even though Los Angeles isn't considered to have quite as rich a jazz tradition as some of the other major American cities like New York, New Orleans and Chicago, California has provided the world with a number of the jazz greats like Dexter Gordon, Chet Baker, Eric Dolphy and Charles Mingus. 4 members of the LA-based jazz collective West Coast Get Down feature on the album. Thundercat on the bass, Terrace Martin on sax and keyboards, Kamasi Washington on sax, and Ronald Bruner Jr. on drums all feature in various spots on the album. Terrace Martin especially exerted a really strong influence on the record, being on every track except for Institutionalized and I. Let's have a close look at him playing on the album's most famous song, Alright. Pharrell produced the beat, and there's another song by rapper Fabulous that uses the same beat that was made before, though released after, Kendrick's version of Alright. Listen to his version without the jazz influence compared to Kendrick, and hear the difference that Martin's saxophones make.
You don't even know, every day a so-called friend turn foe.
All's my life, hard times like, yeah.
Martin also played an important conceptual role in the album. For example, he showed Kendrick the Spike Lee film Mo Better Blues, which would give him the idea to make a track like for free.
Oh shit! For the style, boy!
Martin would also get another of the key jazz musicians, Robert Glasper, involved on the record. Glasper was originally brought in just for free as the record's most overtly jazzy moment. Kendrick asked Glasper to specifically compliment his rapping, and Glasper in turn conceptualized Kendrick as a sax player taking a solo.
Fuck, more abortion, more divorce, course and portion. My check with less endorsement left me dormant, dusted, doom, disgusted, force away, fuck you figures.
As opposed to just working with a singer or an MC. Interestingly, Glasper's involvement came from his own desire rather than Kendrick specifically wanting to work with him, with Glasper being a big fan of his previous record, Good Kid, Mad City. This is something that was quite new about To Pimp A Butterfly. It was the first mainstream jazz rap album for a while, but it was by no means the first overall. People as diverse and famous as A Tribe Called Quest and Miles Davis had been putting the two genres together decades before Kendrick did.
Honey, check it out, you got me mesmerized. With your black hair and your fat thighs.
But here there was perhaps a greater cohesion than seen before. Kamasi Washington, who played sax on You, pointed out that the generation of jazz musicians playing on To Pimp A Butterfly were the first generation of jazz musicians who were brought up on hip-hop and would grow up alongside rappers and DJs, etc. Sure, jazz musicians had always delved into the world of hip-hop before, like Miles Davis on Bebop, but always as a kind of tourist rather than a true melding of the two genres.
Let's kick a verse for my man called Miles, cause seems to me he's gonna be around for a long while.
Robert Glasper pointed out that, unlike a lot of the more commercially successful jazz rap that came before To Pimp A Butterfly, the record doesn't really use old jazz samples, but actually has the jazz musicians involved directly in the record. If you're enjoying this video, please do leave a like and subscribe, it really helps the channel out, or best of all leave a comment, because I always love hearing what you guys have to say. In Dilshan Veerasingh's writing on Kendrick, he points out some of the specific musical features that the record pulls from jazz. To name just one, the chord progression in Alright pulls from modal jazz. Throughout the whole song, the chords slide between G sharp add 9 and G add 9, the flat 2 and the 1 chord of the key, respectively.
All's my life I has to fight.
So What by Miles Davis and Impressions by John Coltrane, two of the most famous pieces not only of modal jazz, but jazz in general, also use these very same chords. But let's not get carried away. To Pimp A Butterfly isn't a jazz album, it is still a hip-hop album. There's a lot of slightly ridiculous articles and videos and general sentiments saying that Kendrick saved jazz, or that Kendrick is the John Coltrane of hip-hop, whatever that means. In Marcus J. Moore's book on Kendrick, he calls jazz and funk forgotten genres until Kendrick, as if that had ever really been the case. If all of the albums that are touted as completely changed music actually did, then we'd have a musical landscape that completely veers off course every few years. But I digress. Plenty of non-jazz influence is very pervasive on the record. Non-jazz black musicians like Hendrix, Biggie, B.B. King and George Clinton were the musicians being played in the studio during this recording, as well as all this jazz music. Terrace Martin said that there wasn't a conscious effort to incorporate specifically jazz, but funk, soul, all manner of black music really. In fact, he said that he didn't even know what to call the album. So let's have a look at one of the album's least jazz-influenced tracks to see what's so different about it than the more jazz-inspired ones. King Kunta, which was one of the album's biggest songs, is pretty much a West Coast hip-hop song through and through. There's very little jazz in it at all. But it wasn't always this way. King Kunta was originally meant to be jazzier, with flutes and all this kind of thing. But Soundwave was told by Kendrick to make it more nasty, to make it a bit more like fellow Compton native DJ Quick.
Cause y'all ain't drinking mine up, you better drink that E&J and Parmesan and the rest of that wine up.
This shouldn't come as a surprise though, because To Pimp A Butterfly is a nod to black music and broader black culture in general, hence the presence of so much jazz, not a rejection of the West Coast hip-hop that Kendrick was surrounded by. It's got features from Snoop Dogg and perhaps the most West Coast hip-hop sound there is, the G-Funk whistle. But it isn't just the lack of saxophones that makes King Kunta less jazz-inspired than the rest of the record. It's the actual way that Kendrick raps over the instrumental, which we'll take a closer look at now. John J. Matisich has done a great analysis of Kendrick's flow, including on King Kunta, and he argues that Kendrick's flow can either be derivative, in the sense that it's derived from the beat, or generative, in the sense that it generates itself independently of the track. On this spectrum of flow between derivative and generative, King Kunta, as a more traditional West Coast hip-hop track, rests comfortably on the derivative end of the spectrum. Again, derivative here means derived from, not unoriginal. Let's look, for example, at the chorus of King Kunta. There's nothing jazz in the instruments, there's no saxophones or upright bass or drum kit, but Kendrick's rapping itself is a lot more to the grid. The vast majority of the emphasis comes directly on beat. It's firmly rooted in 4/4. The first beat of the bar is incredibly clear and the rhyme scheme is regular and simple. He rhymes walking with talking and off him with losses on the exact same beats every single bar.
Bitch, where you and I was walking. Now I run a game, got the whole world talking. King Kunta.
There's elements of funk in the bass line, but nothing really jazz. Okay, so King Kunta isn't particularly jazz influenced, so what? Well, what happens when there is a jazz inspired instrumental for Kendrick to rap over? Does he do it the same way? Well, we only need to look back one track on the album to find out, on For Free. As I mentioned earlier, it's the most overtly jazz influenced song on the whole album, at least in the instrumental. It takes from other black music too, but sounds more like old acoustic jazz than anything else. Matisich describes the track as possessing no structural relationship between the rhythms and the vocals and the metrical implications of the instrumental track. Kendrick here is basically abandoning the constraints of rapping to the beat and instead prioritising semantic concerns. Extremely intricate rhyme schemes, for example, create a cohesion and a phrasing that allows for Kendrick to rap in a totally different way than on King Kunta. I think the best example of this in For Free comes in Kendrick's repetition of the phrase matter of fact. Maybe this will sound a bit stupid to some people, but I feel like if you tune out the words, by the third repetition it doesn't even particularly sound like the human voice, but rather like a saxophone or something else instead.
Matter of fact, I need interest. Matter of fact, it's 9 inches. Matter of fact, see your friendship based.
I wouldn't even be the first person to make this comparison with Kendrick either. Robert Glasper said that Kendrick literally sounds like different instruments to him, sometimes a trumpet, sometimes a saxophone, and that when Kendrick raps he's behaving like a jazz musician taking a solo, rather than an MC. For Free was the track that Glasper was originally brought into play on, and Kendrick asked Glasper to play in a style specifically complementary to his rapping, or I suppose blowing as Glasper really felt it. So Kendrick was really playing as part of the band rather than just rapping over a beat like most. But we can go a level deeper than this as well, and examine why Kendrick's flow takes on a more jazz-inspired tone. This next bit might be a little bit confusing, but bear with it because it does have a clear point at the end. Mostly, rap music has been pretty constrained to the 16-position grid. In the documentary Something From Nothing, The Art of Rap, rapper Rakim talks about how he draws a literal grid to put his words on. Since you're watching this video, chances are you've probably seen this Vox video at some point. They talk about that in this video, if it rings any bells. Anyway, even a lot of the jazz rap before To Pimp A Butterfly is pretty constricted to this, but Kendrick really manages to get away from it on this album. Mitchell Oriner has done amazing work on analysing rap flow on a micro level, and I highly would recommend you read his whole work because it's fascinating. But part of his work compares the flow in Alright, with its more on-the-grid flow, with Mama, which veers off into normal speech patterns. He's got loads of really helpful graphs in his work, which, as always, is linked in the sources. But we're going to look at these spirals to understand how Kendrick's flow works here on a micro level. If we look at this spiral, and be careful to note that it is a spiral, not concentric circles, each clockwise rotation around the spiral is one beat. Note, one beat, not one bar. We all know what a clock face looks like, so let's imagine that the spiral is a clock face. Alright is at a tempo of 110 beats per minute, so one beat is just over 0.54 recurring seconds long. Let's call it 0.55 seconds, or 550 milliseconds. Since it's a clock face, we'll divide 550 by 60 to find that each minute on this spiral is just over 9 milliseconds in or right. If we do the same maths on Mama, it's about 12 milliseconds, since the song is a little bit slower. Once you get to around 25 to 40 milliseconds, you start to be able to perceive difference in lengths of time. If this all sounds a bit prolix, confusing and unnecessary, when Kendrick is rapping more than about 3 to 5 minutes on the clock face out of time, it becomes perceivable to our ears and sounds like Kendrick is rapping completely off the grid.
And when I wake up, I recognize you looking at me for the pay cut.
And he does this quite liberally in Mama, pulling and pushing way off the actual beats.
I know you know the lines for Compton School District.
I don't need to tell anybody that this is not because Kendrick can't rap in time, but like the generative flow we talked about earlier, Kendrick is harnessing his natural speech patterns and imposing them on the track, rather than sticking heavily to the 16 position grid. Thank you so much for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed. Again, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe and best of all a comment, and thanks for watching.